Okay. Okay, so welcome again, everyone. Welcome to this webinar called Support Networks for Inclusion, Joining Forces Towards a Common Goal. I am very happy to see you all, both speakers and participants. Really, really happy. Just a very quick detail. We're going to have 4 presentations, and then we're going to have space for discussion. I'm going to go over the agenda in just a few minutes. So just to tell you, if you have any question, just note it down, or either in the chat or on paper. And then we will have ample space for questions and answers towards the end of the meeting. Let me just give you some background info on the webinar and also on Arqus, as we have a lot of external participants today. I'm very pleased to have people who do not belong to the Arqus community, but who will be very passionate fans of the Arqus Alliance very soon. So the Arqus European University Alliance is one of the first batch of European University Alliances to be approved and funded by the European Commission. And it started its activity back in October 2019. It is an alliance composed of 7 partners. It is coordinated by the University of Granada, and then the members are the University of Padua, the University of Graz, the University of Leipzig, Lyon, Bergen, and Vilnius in Lithuania. The structure of the alliance it is articulated in 7 action lines covering very different topics: teaching and learning, mobility, European citizenship, etc. Our action line is Action Line 2, which is devoted to inclusion. It is called Widening Access, Inclusion and Diversity, and it is chaired by the University of Padua. Such a structure of the alliance makes it so that we have very shared responsibility across the alliance for carrying out all the activities. Action Line 2, I'm not going over, of course, all the activities because there are many and they are quite complex, but one of the activities is 2.4, which is called Support Networks for Inclusion. And this webinar is precisely organized by this task force. The task force has been working for many months in getting to know each other and getting to know especially what support networks are in place at the different partner universities, especially for vulnerable and disadvantaged students and staff. And this becomes very, very relevant when we think that one of the core features of European University Alliances is mobility, as we are supposed to become a European campus. So students and staff are supposed to be able to move from one university to the other. And of course, this implies that all of our students and staff, which are very, very numerous, of course, everybody is supposed to be able to have the same opportunities and to enjoy all the outcomes that mobility brings. So, of course, international mobility becomes a very interesting test bed for support networks for inclusion. And one of the main outputs that is expected from this task force is a sort of guidebook, which will be presented today by Victoria Ressler from the University of Graz, member of our task force. I will introduce the speakers just in a few minutes. And the guidebook sort of shows all the support networks that are in place at the different universities. We try to have a very wide approach, but I think Victoria will speak about it later. The other output, which was expected by this task force, is the organization of 3 webinars within this first funding period. And this is the 3rd webinar. The first 2 that we organized were focused on exchange of good practices, challenges, and experiences. And sorry, I think there's somebody with the microphone on? Sorry. So the first two were more of exchange of good practices, challenges and experiences in support networks for inclusion, so that we had like a general overview of support networks across the whole alliance. And in this last webinar, we thought it would be interesting to open up to other networks and organizations dealing with inclusion. So here we are, and I am really happy to have both our speakers and our participants. And good morning, Valerie. Welcome.
Thank you.
So I am just going over the agenda very briefly so that we can get to know the speakers. If I forget any detail, I invite the speakers to introduce themselves as well, because of course I will forget things. And of course, if you have any questions, just feel free to ask them at the, as I was saying, when we will have the space for discussion. So right now we're going to start with Valerie Van Hess, who's the coordinator of CEHO Support Center Inclusive Higher Education. We'll especially focus on some of the projects that the organization has been following lately. Then we will have Martin Bogdan, Policy and Project Officer at the Academic Cooperation Association, who will especially focus on how ACA is supporting Erasmus Plus national agencies in developing approaches to inclusion at the national level. Then we will have Juan Rayon, President of the European Student Network, who will provide us with the students' perspective on the issue of inclusive mobility. And we will close our round of speakers with Victoria Ressler, University of Graz, and member of our task force support network for inclusion. And she will present the guidebook, which has been produced by the task force. Then we will have a coffee break. And after the coffee break, please come back with a lot of questions so that we can have a very nice discussion for more or less the following hour. So before I give the floor to our first speaker, let me also thank all participants. And just to inform our speakers, some of the participants were those who participated in the Staff Week on Inclusive Mobility in Ghent last March, and I'm very happy to see you all. And some of the participants are colleagues from the mobility unit of at the University of Padua, and I'm very happy to have them as well. We have just launched a very small working group on inclusive mobility, which we hope to develop further in the future. And of course, I want to acknowledge and thank the members of our task force 2.4 who are here today, and of course Benedetta Zatti, who is the chair of Action Line 2. I hope I did not forget anybody, and Sara, who's taking care of the technical aspects as well. So I'm sorry for taking up your time, and without further ado, I will give the floor to Valerie. Valerie, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Lucia, for the invitation. I'm very happy to share some insights that we have been working on the topic of inclusive mobility. I will try to share my presentation, but it's going a bit, I think it's coming. Yep. Okay, so I was asked to present a little bit the work that we have been doing on making mobility programs more inclusive. I will focus on some key criteria and foremost on tools that you can also use in your university setting or in your alliance setting on the topic of inclusive mobility. I'm working at the Support Center for Inclusive Higher Education in the Flemish community. We are embedded by decree, so you will find us in higher education legislation, and our focus is that we serve both policymakers and higher education institutions in the development and implementation of equity and inclusion measures for higher education. So we are focusing more broader than only inclusive mobility, but one of the topics that we tackled with CEHO was inclusive mobility. Why? It was already long in the Flemish community a tradition to work on the topic of inclusion connected to mobility. In 2013, we had our action plan, Brains on the Moves, as you can see here. And there was specific attention for inclusion. We focused on setting targets for participation of all students in mobility programs. And we aimed that 33% of the students of the Flemish community would have an experience abroad. And we also focused on creating a database for the government, and which would allow us also to monitor the participation of students in mobility programs. In the specific attention, we focused that 33% of the mobile students should belong to underrepresented groups, and we defined them at that moment because that were the student groups where we had validated numbers of participation in higher education, that were students with a study grant, students with disability, and working students. So we aimed that of our mobile students, 33% should belong to these groups. Here you see a sheet of the participation as we are doing comprehensive monitoring, and there you see already that 22% of the mobile students belong to underrepresented groups. We didn't reach the aim, but we are now working on the new internationalization strategy, in which we will again focus already on and target and the participation of underrepresented groups. But we were already happy with those participation numbers. We had put some measures, for example, we launched campaigns, but also we allocated specific funding towards universities so that they would give priority to students of underrepresented groups. So we installed some measures at the Flemish level in cooperation with the higher education institutions. But important is that we don't only look at the numbers of participation, we also looked more in depth with surveys on what are our inclusion officers mentioning on the topic of inclusive mobility, and that was a research that we did in 2018. And there we saw a lot of attention points, so that we still had work on a better registration and monitoring of students, on promotion of outward mobilities, reliable data. But for most, we encountered struggles at European level in the agreements with other universities, in the agreement with other governments on the transportability of support services. And so that was at the moment also the topics we should do something at European level. When we looked at the European level status, we also noticed that the special needs students are very limited in participation, as well as disadvantaged students. So, for example, in this graph, you see that there's no much progress the past decade on that specific topic. And that was the moment where we said we should take action, because what we learned from our students was that they are very interested in mobility programs. It's not a lack of motivation. There are too many different types of barriers that occur and limit their participation. So that was the moment where we said we should do something at the European level, and we searched for cooperation. And one of the partners was ESN, who is represented here as well, in which we started up some projects, as well as together with ACA, with Martin, we also focused on another inclusive mobility project. So we have run two projects. It was the EPFIME project, foremost on focusing on students with disabilities. That project lasted until May last year, and we just finished also the project peer learning activities and resources for social inclusion in mobility programs. So I will shortly present the outcomes of those projects, because both projects have really been focusing on the participation and inclusion measures, and also on what can we foremost do and how can we support universities on this specific topic. So I will take you now through the outputs that we have made. maybe important to mention, if we look, we have done in both of the projects some desk research. We have gathered online surveys focusing not only on the perspective of students, disadvantaged students, but also on higher education institutions, and foremost also on ministries of education. And that really gave us a comprehensive view on what are the needs of the different stakeholders. We also did peer learning activities with ministries of education, national agencies, and higher education institutions focus group, and that allowed us to make the outputs that I will present. Just mentioning also, there's a strong definition on inclusive mobility. I've put it here on the slide. So it's meaning and ensuring adequate conditions for students to work, study, or volunteer abroad. And for most, it's a needs-based approach. So that means that we really look and focus at the needs that the students is reporting on the topic of inclusive mobility, what the students need to make it a successful experience. From an inclusive perspective, we also have put a lot of energy in defining disadvantaged groups. We see it's really important to focus as widely as possible. It's not only about students with disadvantaged background, it's also about students who are underrepresented because, for example, their study program is underrepresented in mobility programs. In our e-learning packages, we focus more in depth on the definitions of inclusion. But for most, looking at the different stakeholders, we have defined strong points of attention on the domains on where university could improve. It's on the strategies in inclusive mobility, but it's also in information provision and promotion. It's also about offering grants, also funding application. It's also about support services, student life, and awareness and cooperation. So there are really a number of barriers that should be tackled and a number of domains that higher education institutions should focus on. Important also to say, if we look at the disadvantaged students, we have some general barriers who are similar for all the disadvantaged students, but we also have some group-specific barriers. I have not the time to go in depth to them, but if you look at our resources, you will find information about the general and the group-specific barriers. So that's also important to make your mobility programs more inclusive. So based on those categories that we have identified, we have made now resources that tackles and take into account those barriers. So here you see an overview of the different tools that we have made. You can find on our website, inclusivemobility.eu, the toolbox with interesting reports with all the research finding of the both projects. We also made, and I will show you very briefly, the inclusivemobility.eu platform. It's a platform centralizing all the information about higher education institutions, mobility programs, but also the information on national inclusion measures towards disadvantaged students. But for most to support higher education institutions in implementing an inclusive strategy, we made a framework bringing together the main areas on what university should focus on, and also action points that you could undertake to realize those objectives on information provision, mobility strategies, and also on the topic of awareness and cooperation. We also created a self-assessment tool, and the self-assessment tool is a tool that allows you as a higher education institutions or a ministry representative or a national agency representative to reflect on those objectives. So if you go through the self-assessment tool and you answer the questions about the different topics, you will receive some feedback on what are already the current strengths of your universities and what are more the weaknesses, or what are the points you could improve on to reach out to an institutional strategy on inclusive mobility. So the self-assessment tool is reflecting on all the objectives that we have in the framework of those topics. But it's also important when you have more an overview on what are my strengths or what are the points that we didn't have installed yet. It's important to get some inspiration and to get some concrete action points on how could I install or how could I work on that specific topic. And that's why we have created also a training package and guidelines. We even have created the training packages in an e-learning package so that you also can access and make exercises in a more interactive way on that topic. We have focused on creating for each of the main areas that I just presented. We have created some learning contents in which you can reflect on the topic, and then you can also learn about some concrete tips and tricks on how you can work on that specific topic. Interesting for you is that in our years that we have been working, we also have gathered some inspiring practices from universities, but also from ministries, and also some testimonies of student ambassadors on the topic of inclusive mobility. And we have in the e-learning integrated those topics. So you will find there some exercises, testimonials, but also some inspiring cases on the topic of inclusive mobility, for example, specific on how can you get the support of your leadership in your university, or how can you make your mobility programs more inclusive on the topic of communication. In that sense, we also created a communication guideline with tips and tricks on how to communicate more inclusive on the topic of mobility. You will also find that on the website. And also ESN created some communication package, and a communication package with some visuals and also a PowerPoint template that you also can use in your specific context so that you can reach out towards students, disadvantaged students also in an inclusive way. We created also with SIGO some testimonials on the topic of inclusive mobility. So on the website of Inclusive Mobility, you will also find really inspiring testimonials, video testimonials of disadvantaged students who went abroad and who also testify about the challenges, but for most, the benefits, the support they get, and how it has changed their life. So that's, I think, very inspiring also to use in your own context, because we know that the student ambassador approach is one of the really supportive ways on making and reaching out to disadvantaged students. So I have not the time to go in depth to all those topics, but I invite you to look at it in the topics. So here you see also the link to the Inclusive Mobility website. I don't have, Lucia, I think, the time to go really through the website, but I think you can explore it in the same. What's important, because some of you maybe know the website that we launched already a year ago, what we have done now together with ESN is really broadening the scope and contents. So in that sense, you can easily make an institutional page as higher education institutions, and a lot of universities already did this, but is focused until so far on students with disabilities. So Juan and myself are inviting you here also to update your institutional page and also add the measures that you are taking more broader towards other disadvantaged student groups also in your university. Also, the ministries and national agencies are working on that topic. For example, last week, 2 weeks ago, I was in Austria also, where we looked with the higher education institutions on this topic to the follow-up. You will also there find the communication and training materials that I have explained, and there we have also broadened. So you will there also find now testimonials about working students, pioneer students, students students with a migration background, a refugee background. So I think it's really worth to look more in depth now at the content that we have created. You will also find an instruction video explaining you in 2 minutes how our framework, self-assessment tool and the e-learning package are related, and you also receive a sneak preview of those topics. But what we discussed also with Lucia was that it's really important to work, and I think that the tools are hands-on, so you can easily start the process with the tools specifically for a higher education institution, national agency of Ministry for Education. But what we noticed at CIGO, because as I was mentioning, we are also working on the topic of inclusion at large. We have focused specifically the past years on the topic of inclusion in mobility. So that's number 8 of the principles and guidelines on social dimension. And what we have done at this moment is that we started tomorrow, in 2 days, we officially start a new project, and that's focusing on peer learning activities and resources to underpin the other principles and guidelines on social dimension across the European higher education area. As you know, and I think it's also a principle or an important document in the alliance of Lucia, the principles and guidelines are really the intentions of the ministries of higher education to work really to enhance the social dimension across European higher education more broad. So it's also focusing, for example, on student mental health, on teaching and learning, on data collection, on community engagements. So in this new project, it will last 3 years. We will again set up peer learning activities on those topics, and based on the identified needs of the different countries on the topic, we will also create for each of the principles a framework, a self-assessment tool, and resources. So that means that we are ready. I think principle 8 is already filled with a lot of resources, but now it's the focus of the consortium together also with the European Student Union to focus now on the other principles and also create some tools. One of the first topics that we'll take up is, for example, the students' mental health, because that's also, I think, a topic that's of very interest at this moment in the higher education institutions where we also have our cooperations. So that's, Lucia, a little bit in a nutshell. I didn't have the time to really go in depth to the tools, but I hope it's made clear that there's lots available on which higher education institutions could focus on. So if there are questions, I'm happy to take them.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Valerie. Thank you very much. And sorry, I didn't see your email. I just saw it now.
Martin.
Sorry about that.
No.
So thank you for going over the activities that you've been running with CIGO and with your partners. I think they are very interesting. I'm impressed by the quantity, the amount of work that has been done and of resources that have been made available. And I invite you all to explore a little bit the material that has been made available. I really find it an amazing work. I also really appreciate the widening of the definitions and the scope and content of projects, and the fact that you're going towards working on the social dimension of higher education, which has been a focus of our activities in Arqus for AL2, and it has been sort of the common ground that we set, as it was very difficult to find like a common definition, a common understanding of certain topics, and we found that the definitions that were given in the Annex 2 were of the Rome 2020 Ministerial Communique, where the social dimension was principles and guidelines were presented, were very, very good for us as a starting point to work on. So thank you very much. And I invite everyone to please note down questions or anything for later. So for now, thank you very much again, Valerie, and I will give the floor to Martin Bogdan for his experience with the Erasmus Plus national agencies and their approaches to inclusion at the national level. Martin, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, yeah, also for inviting me to speak here and to share about our experiences on supporting NAs on inclusion. So happy to see many familiar faces. I hope you can see my presentation.
Yes.
The full screen now.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm Martin Borglum from the Academic Cooperation Association. We are a network of funding agencies, which are mostly NAs, but also other agencies supporting internationalization and internationalization of higher education. We are representing them towards the European institutions, but also working on building their capacities and facilitating their cooperation. Besides this, we're also working on different projects, also planning a lot of activities in this field of inclusion, also here with CIHO and with ESN also in the next years. So I will briefly present on our work in the inclusion thematic peer group, as we call it, which gathers people working in the NAs that are our members on the topic of inclusion. We are basically discussing the ongoing issues for the NAs, specific issues, how they work with higher education institutions, but also with support groups. And what we are planning to do more in the future, we are already doing it now, is capacity building, peer learning, and professional development. And we're also trying to monitor how these activities are developing at their level for some mapping exercises. We are also discussing on how the inclusion strategies which they are developing should be designed and how they should be working with the Erasmus Plus program in particular, also following the principles of the Bologna group that were mentioned. Yes, we are also planning to start the informal online inclusion talks where we are planning to bring in people working from support networks and the beneficiaries to sort of assist a little bit to give more insight into the stuff of the NAs. What we have done last year, we have done a consultation on the identification of target groups from the Erasmus Plus implementation guidelines for university for inclusion. And here I think this is interesting just to frame a discussion a little bit on which groups are being tackled this year, and then the situation will slightly change next year with a little bit of broadening of the scope. I think this is also very much in light with some of the results that are in the PLAR for SIMS final report, and also there is the Eurydice recent Eurydice report on inclusion at policy levels, which I think is quite comprehensive, and they all point out to similar conclusions, that the groups which face disabilities, economic barriers, and some health problems are the ones which are being generally tackled mostly, while some other groups are not tackled as much. And this all comes to the question of availability of data, which you can see in this slide, because they have the data on these groups. Also, as you can see here, we have asked who are the ones collecting data at national levels, and roughly the same number of them are either NAs or other funding agencies or higher education institutions, while in some cases these were ministries. Most of the other examples that we got were the combination either of a higher education institution or and the NA. And then we have also asked them which of these groups will be prioritized in the national inclusion strategies and plans, where again we see disabilities, social barriers, health problems, and economic barriers topping the list. I think this is interesting also I think it is important here also to look at the bottom of the table, which includes barriers linked to access to education and training, and cultural differences and so on, because these are the groups which will not be identified immediately, at least before there is data collection methods available in those countries. And I think this is something that we should probably focus on in the near future, on finding ways how to collect this data. I know there are already some of the examples available. Valerie has pointed out to them, especially in Flanders, which I think is sort of a maverick in a sense in this field, in Europe at least, but there are still many challenges in different countries when it comes to which questions can be asked and which questions cannot be asked. So I think this is something that we as a sector should further work on together, and I'm looking forward also to see how this will develop. Here I have taken out some points from the feedback we received from the NAs, what works for them. Mostly the bottom-up approach, where they are holding workshops and meetings with higher education institutions and support groups prior to setting up their strategies and informing the ministries of their policies. Also gathering information before setting up target groups. I think this is very important, because what has come across in the discussions was that the NA staff was not so much aware of the target groups that need to be supported at the higher education institution level. So for example, we would have cases where they would think that the students with children should be those who should be supported financially, but then the feedback from the higher education institutions would come that they are actually very difficult to find. It is very difficult to find the parent students who would go abroad, even with the financial support, which I think kind of adds up more complexity to the issue, and maybe some other ways of supporting them should be found. For example, the BIPs, the blended intensive programs, is one of the popular formats now, as we hear it reported from the NAs, especially for this for this target groups. Also organizing workshop for beneficiaries. This is something along the lines that we have also heard in the International Staff Week in Ghent, but also here that we are discussing on, for example, how to get parents of some students on board, how to motivate them, the whole idea, the whole notion of communication towards different target groups where resources exist and so on. Also, the NAs need further capacity building and sharing experiences between themselves, but also between themselves and the higher education institutions in their countries, but also in other countries. And this is something where ACA will be active in the next year, definitely. And also the necessity to identify other types of support besides financial support. Financial support is the biggest obstacle to mobilities, but also some of the groups have other support necessary. For example, timing is one of the big challenges for working students, especially then, for example, maybe some of the disadvantaged groups have different needs in terms of their study destinations and similar. So to add complexity to the issues, I think this is something that we need to work on further. And I have also outlined here on the moving forward, which pretty much resonates with Valerie's presentation, and I'm sure with Juan, who will be speaking after me, is to find ways, for me at least, I think this is important, to support students with barriers linked to education and their cultural and ethnic backgrounds. In Europe, where the challenges are related to data collection, because as things stand now, in the way that the program, the Erasmus Plus program, is set up, unless they fit into some other categories, there is a chance that they will not be eligible for the inclusion top-ups. And I think this is something that should be tackled in the near future. And I'm looking forward to work on this to support the sector on how to work around this. Also to motivate students who are perhaps not planning to go on a mobility, who are not even thinking about it. And here some other types of internationalization come into play apart from mobility. So we have COILs, internationalization at home, internationalization of curriculum, and so on. And also, as it was mentioned, to engage with the wider society as means of inclusion into international opportunities. So working with the local communities, working with NGOs or some other organizations by bringing international students who are already studying at the university, but also to including those who would be the potential ones, for example, the first year students and so on, and to kind of motivate them for this sort of activities. And also I've added here a point to learn from experiences outside of Europe, especially I think in Latin America, we have some interesting examples of working with the communities, also from other funding programs. I think we can learn a lot. And also for inspiration, I have just put in here some resources we had last year. We had what we call a think piece series of articles from the experts and practitioners who were reflecting on these issues. So I've put a link here in the PowerPoint, which I suppose will be shared with you. So I invite you to have a look, to read the texts. I think they are quite interesting and useful and very, very hands-on. So I think that could be useful. And also we have a project which I can just briefly mention. It's called IHES, Internationalization in Higher Education for Society, where we are trying to combine societal engagement and internationalization at higher education institutions. We have published a mapping report last year, kind of scanning the field, seeing what are the opportunities, how the field looks like. And at the moment, our partners in Spain and Czech Republic, they're working on what we call regional labs, where they are developing specific activities that can be further used in the sectors. Also, I've added a link to the report and the website of the project here. That's all from me, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion later and to get some questions. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Martin. I think you touched upon a lot of very interesting challenges that we have ahead of us. Thank you very much. I find it very interesting to learn this approach of learning also from what is happening outside of Europe, because I feel that sometimes we're very like Europe centered. So I find that very, very interesting. So thank you very much. Since we're a few minutes late, I would give the floor immediately to Juan, President of the Erasmus Student Network. So please, Juan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lucia. Pleasure to be here. And I'm going to be talking a bit about also indeed inclusion and about the findings of our SIM project. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Can you hear me well? Because my sound might be a bit low sometimes. Is it okay, Lucia?
It's okay. We see just a little background noise, but it's fine.
Okay. Okay. Well, great pleasure to be here today. I'm also happy to tell you that a couple of months ago, ESN joined the Arqus Alliance as an associate partner. So after this presentation, we'll be very happy to continue working with you on the topic. I heard something about a group on inclusive mobility. So we'll be very happy to join the group and to support in any way possible with all the data that we have managed to gather in the last few years. I'm going to be talking mainly about our SIM project. So this is a project that we carried out, started a couple of years ago. And one of the main objectives was to gather the student perspective on barriers to mobility and which kind of policy measures we can design at different level to overcome those barriers. Here you can see some of the numbers. We combine student survey, this is the one I'm going to be talking about today, with other elements such as the staff survey and also focus groups and study visits. So we're going to start with the definition part, right? Because I think we can all agree that the definition element, it's key in the debate about inclusive mobility. It's something that Martin has also covered before. And for us, when we did the survey, we mainly cover these four groups: first generation students, ethnic minority, low income and rural students. A very interesting component of our survey was the intersectionality element. So we clearly saw that low income and ethnic minority are quite interlinked with first generation students, and how the intersectionality component plays a very important role in the barriers that students face. Now, we're going to talk a bit about the strategy and the offer, because when we talk about inclusive mobility, the strategy and offer are very important. I think that my colleagues also referred to that. But what we saw in our survey is that the difference between participation in mobility programs, and interest in mobility opportunities from non-mobile participants offer big differences. You can see that in our survey, most mobile participants had participated in the normal Erasmus Plus studies, the typical mobilities between universities, but among non-mobile students, which were almost 40% of the sample, so more than 4,000 students, there was a lot of interest also in different types of mobility opportunities, such as trainships, short-term mobilities, volunteering programs, etc. And this clearly shows that if we manage to have a diversified mobility offer in our university or in collaboration with other partners, such as the municipality that might offer volunteering programs, we're going to be more successful at reaching out to a wide variety of students. So something to consider when we start planning how to promote and how to communicate the opportunities that we offer. And this is where elements like the blend intensive programs come into play. The same applies to mobility duration. So the vast majority of non-mobile students prefer to go on long-term mobility. And this is important to underline when we're talking so much about how BIPs or other tools can be used for inclusive mobility purpose, but still the percentage of non-mobile students from fewer opportunities backgrounds that are interested in different mobility durations is bigger compared to the mobile cohort. So once again, the importance of a diversified mobility offer. Now, probably the most important element of our report, which are the social model that we have developed to explain barriers to mobility. This is an exercise that any higher education institution can do in your institutional context. It can also be done at the national level. It can basically be done at all levels to understand what are the main barriers that our students face in order to go on mobility. We differentiate between 3 different types of barriers that are quite connected with the different types of backgrounds that the students come from. The first type of barrier is institutional. These are the program-related barriers, the ones connected to the funding mechanisms, the recognition elements, the regulations that make the programs happen. So these ones are more completely external to the student, let's say, and more connected to how universities, national agencies, the European Commission set up the programs in which then students participate. And then we move to environmental barriers. These are the ones connected to societal factors, basically the environment around the students. And here is when elements such as access to information are so important. Because of course, depending on the background of the potential participant, the access to information and the interest from the social group is going to completely change the perception that the student has about mobility. If I come from a highly educated background in which going abroad for learning purposes is quite normal, my parents are more likely to encourage me to go abroad, to take these opportunities, etc. But this doesn't apply if I come from a different type of background. My friends are not really keen on this kind of international experiences, etc. And then finally, attitudinal barriers. These are the internalized barriers in which, as you know very well, because you see this in your universities all the time, students might say, mobility is not really for me. I am a bit afraid. I'm going to miss out if I go. I lose friends, etc. Of course, we cannot see these 3 types of barriers as isolated elements. They are quite intertwined, and one leads to the other, right? Because if students perceive that there are more institutional barriers, they are more likely to develop their own attitudinal barriers. So something to consider, something that you can start working on maybe with your students in your own university by developing personas and trying to come up with ideas on how to overcome the different barriers. But now moving to the more practical side of the barrier element. Martin already pointed out, and Valerie as well, but financial elements are extremely important. The vast majority of students, when asked about the barriers they face, they still refer to the practical barriers that financial elements pose. And when we talk about financial barriers, we talk about the amount of money that the students receive, but also about the timing, which is something that is already many times left out of the debate. More specifically, we're talking about the need to advance initial cost by students, and also the loss of income, loss of student job while abroad. But I would really like to focus on this one, on how paying the grants late can result on students not being able to go abroad or not being able to fully enjoy their mobilities, just like their peers who are more who are better off and who can have access to different types of funding. So this is something to consider, because as you can see, the three main types of barriers are quite connected with financial elements, right? Either the need to advance initial cost, the opportunity cost of losing a student job, and also the additional debt incurred from a longer degree program. For years, it was said that Erasmus grants were supposed to cover only the difference between countries, right? This is how they were designed. But of course, if we want to make mobility programs more inclusive, we need to have another mentality, because otherwise only students who are financially well off will be able to go abroad. Of course, there are also other relevant barriers, such as the personal ones, interruption to social ties, absence of family, etc. But it's important to understand that for mobile participants, those financial barriers are quite relevant. Once again, we managed to get some data on this component of paying grants upfront, and we see that more than a quarter of students reported receiving their grants more than 1 month after the beginning of their mobilities. And the very interesting thing here is that this really varies depending on the country. So you can see that 3 of the biggest countries in the Erasmus Plus program are actually the laggards in terms of paying the grants upfront. Spain, France, and Italy have, I'm really sorry to say this, but terrible rates in terms of the timing of the grants, and size cannot be used as a normal excuse, because we see that the numbers from Germany are completely different. So this is a policy debate that we need to have. How are we ensuring that students receive their grants on time? We all know how relevant bureaucracy is and how challenging it can be for students. So once again, with the same survey, we saw that administrative barriers make the process difficult to follow for many students, and that these barriers have different components. One is about the financing, right? What we mentioned before. And there, we, in my opinion, should consider a complete overhaul of the way in which we pay Erasmus Plus grants. So we should try to move, especially when we talk about the students with fewer opportunities, to a system in which pre-financing becomes the norm. So all students that come from fewer opportunities background should receive the complete grant, in our opinion, before the mobility. And then we can design measures in which, of course, if they don't fulfill the criteria, they need to pay the grant back. But the norm should move towards this concept of pre-financing, which is, by the way, what the Erasmus Plus regulation envisions. The same when it comes to the adaptation of the mobility grants. This is something that the NAs, together with national authorities, can do from year to year. So they have all the sway to change the grants if, of course, there's the political willingness at the national level to adjust grant levels and to give more money from national contribution. But here are a couple of things that NAs can do in the near future to try to make mobility grants more accessible. Now moving to the blocking factors for non-mobile students. So before I show you a bit of the data coming from mobile participants who also report barriers to mobility, but now I want to show you a bit what non-mobile students say in terms of blocking factors. Here, funding comes again, so funding stands out, but I think it's worth spending a couple of moments just looking at other elements, such as the lack of flexibility and the concerns about impact on their academic achievement. So students are very concerned that their degrees are not flexible enough to allow them to go on mobility, because they are afraid that they will not have the same performance or the credits will not be recognized. So this is why targeted promotion and communication is so important, because the fears among students with fewer opportunities are bigger compared to the normal cohort of students, to students that do not come from those backgrounds. So we really need to coach them and work with these kind of whole institution approaches to convince students that if they go on mobility, their academic achievement is actually going to improve in most cases and not going to diminish. And then we also see that lack of knowledge, personal reasons, or lack of recognition more specifically appear in the list of concerns, but with big differences compared to these funding and flexibility related barriers. Now, the cost of living, I'm going to go very fast through this part because I think that we have already covered before, but indeed, the cost of living that the students report, as you can see, is around 500 and 700 euros, or more than 700 in most cases, is way higher than the average mobility grant that the Commission reported in 2020, which was 370 euros per month. So there is a need to adjust that. Hopefully, the new top-ups will play a key role there, but it's something that we need to consider in terms of access to mobility. And here's the comparison between the offered support and the needed support. And you can see that the students with fewer opportunities report that they need basically between 75% and 1% of their expenses covered to be able to access mobility opportunities. And indeed, that students with fewer opportunities report this in higher numbers, and that intersectionality has a big influence. So if students come from those intersectionality backgrounds, such as the combination between ethnic minority and a low income background, there is a bigger need to cover for most of the expenses if we want these students to really have the chance to go abroad on an equal basis compared to their peers. Now a bit on student support. Which kind of measures can we provide at the university level to support students going on mobility? We asked the students in our SIM survey what are the most useful things that they need in terms of information to motivate them to go abroad. And three things clearly stood out. The information about available funding. So students really want to know how much money they're going to get, when they are going to get it, in which conditions, what do they need to do, etc. The support with the application process. So having a clear timeline, understanding all the steps, seeing clearly when they're going to have to do the application, where are they going to get the documents, etc. And something very interesting, which probably we don't do that often, and in which student organizations like ESN are in general, alumni networks can be very helpful, which is help choosing a host university. Because of course, interest of students might vary. And if you're able to help students with choosing a university depending on their interest and needs, we're going to be helping them to make that final decision and take the step and go abroad. So just something to consider. Of course, there are more elements such as meetings with international officers, information sessions, but as you can see, there's a big difference in terms of the perceived relevance of these tools. And here you can see the list of the numbers, right? With the meetings, the group sessions, briefing events, etc. What is interesting once again is to compare mobile participants with non-mobile participants. So for non-mobile participants, these events are even more important, especially the peer-to-peer component. So as you can see, students also really value attending events organized by student organizations. This is something that you can do if you have ESN sections in your universities. You can collaborate with them, not only to support incoming students, but also to promote mobility, to connect students, to make sure that maybe students that are going to go to certain countries can meet with international students from those countries, etc. Then indeed, this survey was conducted during the COVID pandemic, so health concerns were also raised by students, and it's important to draw some lessons from that period so we can understand how we can support the students also in terms of their health, mental health, etc. And now one of the final parts, because now there's been a lot of talk in the last few years on the role of multipliers, the role of alumni, ambassadors. And we see that when we ask students whether they want to take this role and become multipliers and ambassadors, they're actually very keen on doing it. The majority of students say that they would be keen on joining a student association, becoming a mobility ambassador, or becoming a buddy/mentor. So you can see that the majority, is considerable. But unfortunately, in most cases, they do not really feel that they are supported by the home institution, so the sending institution, to become part of these networks or to take that step and become ambassadors or mentors. So when you are now thinking about your mobility strategies, your international strategies, you can also consider this component, how we can work to motivate students to join these networks and to have that role of reaching out to more students and increasing participation in mobility. Because we believe in ESN that one of the most impactful things that we can do to foster inclusive mobility is to turn students, alumni, and stakeholders into your biggest allies. So they are directly involved in the creation of inclusion action plans and also the implementation of those action plans, very in the Erasmus Plus regulation, in which we have kind of the overall structure of the Erasmus Plus program. Now, the final part, some student impressions related to the perceived experience of students, in which we see that the vast majority of students from fewer opportunities did have positive experience while abroad, but also a considerable number say that they felt that they were treated differently or unfairly at the host university. So the reception of students from fewer opportunity backgrounds is also quite important to avoid that these situations arise. And also 15% felt that they did not have equal access to resources and opportunities compared to home students. So that the quality of treatment, which is very important to ensure quality experience. Here you can see the breakdown of those numbers, in which, like we see that 34%, in which the majority is actually, like sometimes or rarely. So it's not that it happens all the time. So we should to avoid that it becomes, like common in our universities. Still, the vast majority say that they did not experience any form of discrimination. It's just a quarter, which is still quite high of students. And most of the discrimination was connected to nationality, unfortunately, right? So depending on the nationality, students had different experiences in terms of the discrimination or the treatment in their hosting universities. And when it comes to the academic impact, we see that the vast majority feel that the academic achievement actually improved and increased after the mobility, and it's only 10% that feel that there was a decrease. Finally, what are our recommendations? Well, we have a big set of recommendations that you can check in our report, and we'll be happy to discuss it with you later. But indeed, aspects such as financial clarity and a very streamlined process, starting the mobility promotion from an early age. This is something that the Alliance mentioned, I think, a couple of times, and we believe is very relevant. So partner up with schools, high schools, community centers, to talk about opportunities even before higher education, to relaunch or revamp the scholarship system, also at the institutional level, thinking how you can tweak it a bit to make sure that students have an early access to the grants, they have proper grants to cover for their participation. Creating that culture of mobility and internationalization, this is very much connected with the idea of whole institution approaches. So not only the IRO, the Vice Rector for Internationalization pushing for mobility, but actually trying to involve professors, trying to involve the whole institution to convince students to go abroad. Then outlining the academic attainment and competence development of the students, so they understand what kind of things they're going to learn if they go abroad, and they are more motivated to do it. They're not afraid of losing out in terms of their academic achievement and how their grades are affected, etc. And of course, as we said before, this targeted peer-to-peer promotion involving alumni, working with former participants and with your students to reach out to a more diverse part of the student body. So here are some of our proposals. Thank you so much for the time, and we'll be happy to discuss them with you at the end of the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Juan, for your presentation. Just a very technical thing before we go on. We're running 10 minutes late, and it's my fault because I spent too much time talking at the beginning. But if you don't mind, I would really like Victoria to speak now before the coffee break, so then we can have the discussion later. I don't know if you agree with me. Okay. Thank you. And as far as what Ernest was asking in the chat, I would please invite the speakers to share their presentations with me, and I would share them with all the participants in the meeting so that we can all have the material. So going back to Juan, thank you very much for your presentation. Juan was at the University of Padua as well, so he knows the place very well, and we're waiting for him to come back soon. And I know that ESN had its 30th birthday celebration just last Friday, so happy birthday, ESN. And I guess your presentation was very interesting, especially for our international and mobility officers that are here present, and also for the students. Now, I would really like to try and put pieces together, as the presentation from Victoria will be slightly different, but I think it's closely linked to what was talked about so far. We will go back to talking about support networks and services in place at different Arqus partner universities, not only financial, but very practical and material, especially for vulnerable and disadvantaged students and staff. So we will be talking about, Victoria, of course, will go into detail, support networks in place, both for home students and also those who will be incoming students from other universities. So I would really, this I think will really start our reflections on how to put finally pieces together, and we will go on then in the discussion asking questions to our speakers and trying to figure out how to have a more inclusive alliance and higher education system and so on. So Victoria, please, the floor is yours. Victoria, are you speaking? Because I cannot hear you. Victoria? I think.
Sorry, 1 second. I just tried to.
Sorry, I was not seeing you on my screen, so I didn't know what was going on.
Yeah, I'm sorry, because I have like 3 screens here, and everyone, every screen is doing something different. I'm sorry. Can you see my presentation now?
Now everything works properly. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, I'm really happy to present you our work and output from our Arqus Task Force 2.4, Support Networks for Inclusion. And I will give you like a small insight in our guidebook we produced, but I will also talk about the process and our work behind the guidebook. We put together services, support networks for inclusion in this guidebook for underrepresented, disadvantaged, and vulnerable student groups across the Arqus universities. So now to the process. And sorry, I think I'm not in the right mode. Sorry. The screens, I'm sorry. Okay, so our first step was to set up a task force. We started in 2019, and we tried to identify our experts at every partner university. And then we just decided who can contribute to the topic and work together in this task force. Our second step was getting familiar with the topic, because we had to find a common ground and talk about the practices already in place and the support services, the schemes we had at each partner university. So therefore we had regular meetings where we brainstormed and also discussed our perceptions of the terms, definitions, and the practices, and also talked about our services and networks already in place. We tried to set up a mapping. So we did it, and we mapped our best practices and made a report, a mapping report out of that. To just depict all services already in place, just to find out where we stand, where's the status quo. This questionnaire and mapping report built like the basis for our next steps, the webinars 1 and 2, where we again talked about our best practices and also the challenges we have in setting up such networks, or the challenges that can occur when setting up those networks for inclusion. After that, the mapping report and the webinars again build the basis for the next step, the guidebook, and our final output. And we decided to put together all the relevant services and networks at our Arqus universities already in place. And now we're at step 6, at our third webinar and the presentation of our guidebook. And I want to talk about the challenges that occurred. Of course, we had to find common definitions for all the terms we are using, such as support network. What is a support network? So we had to talk about this as a first step. What are underrepresented, disadvantaged, and vulnerable groups? We had to find a common ground also for that. And as a reference for the definition of underrepresented, disadvantaged, and vulnerable students, we used the glossary presented in the Annex 2 of the Rome Ministerial Communique on the principles and guidelines to strengthen the social dimension of higher education in the European higher education area. So also each university has a different local context, history, and also legal regulations and structures that also affect the student population and the target groups. So we had to find out, how does the student population look in Granada, in Padova, in Graz, and so on. And what is our target group, or what are our target groups? Yeah, so to say, not all underrepresented, disadvantaged, and vulnerable student groups are represented at each university equally due to structures and regulations. So not each university is able to implement every kind of network or service. Yeah, but we just found a first way to find a common ground and to set up this guidebook. Yeah, so to our guidebook now. As I said, we were able to create a great output, namely our guidebook on support networks for inclusion. The guidebook presents the support services at Arcus universities that focus on underrepresented, disadvantaged, and vulnerable groups. It takes into consideration every aspect of a person's life towards his or her educational and professional path. So we collected the support networks of each university and then subdivided them according to the phases of the student life cycle in before entry, at entry, the study framework, and graduation and transition to the job market. In this way, users can also select the university they are interested in and then can quickly find the support offers and networks at the respective study phase. So that was the idea behind it. So I have the honor to to present our collaborative output, and I have also taken advantage of that, and I just will now present to you my personal best practices of our guidebook. So first of all, Samen from the University of Bergen. That was interesting for me because at the University of Graz, we don't have like a welfare organization. We have some services and also some support networks, but we don't have it like gathered in one service or in one organization. And so I found Samen very interesting. It's a welfare organization that provides healthcare for all students, also flats, kindergartens, and training centers. They also provide several courses in numerous subjects, such as academic writing, how to handle stress, how to write a good application, and so on. And I think it's really great to have these services at one place and not like here is one thing and here is another thing, but you have it gathered at the University of Bergen. The second best practice was the student, or is the student house at the University of Granada, which aims at creating a better study environment through taking needs, ideas, projects, and dreams of all students into consideration. Therefore, they have the Laboratory of Ideas, a lifelong learning classroom, the Student Observatory, a debate classroom. And I think it's great that there is such a great place for student engagement, because engagement has always a positive influence on academic success and yeah, on students' well-being as well. And if they feel that they are heard, I think it's a great thing. So I decided to put the student house as a best practice example as well. At the University of Graz, we have the Anti-Bias Circle. There are representatives of various vulnerable, discriminated, disadvantaged staff and also student groups. So staff and students are connected in there, and they are members of the Anti-Bias Circle. It's a centrally located board, and they develop inclusive strategies at our university and try to eliminate discriminatory dynamics and mechanisms in everyday study and work. And there are also workshops like privilege awareness. There's also place for ideas for make the university a more inclusive and open space as well. The University of Leipzig has the team ability, which I found also very interesting because it offers female students with a disability or chronic illness active support for successful studies and an easier transition to work. So they can take advantage of workshops geared to their needs, build important networks to different kinds of workplaces or partners outside the university, and also shape their future study path together with other female students and also mentors. At the University of Lyon, the University for All network allows adults of all ages, whatever their level of education is, to attend lectures and participate in cultural outings offered. And its mission is to disseminate culture and provide knowledge in all fields of teaching. So to bring the university to the society and just give everyone the opportunity to participate in university life. At the University of Padua, I found very interesting that there's support for students in detention. It helps students in detention to obtain their degree. There are dedicated tutors that help them during their studies, and there is also a common study area where students in detention can have limited access to the internet, and they can also have exams arranged for students in detention. And I find it's a great idea because it's very important to not forget about students in detention. And so education is very important also to give them a better life afterwards. And so I think it's a great support service and network. At Vilnius University, I mean, this is a very sad and also serious example of how quickly things can change, because I remember when we started in 2019, I think there was just, I don't know, one refugee student at the University of Vilnius. and it was not a big issue at the university. Yeah, things have changed, sadly, and of course we all hope that the situation is getting better soon. But I found it great that Vilnius University put up an information and counseling service for all applicants from the Ukraine in such a short amount of time. And yeah, maybe also our network, our Arqus network, already helped to get those practices in place very quickly. So I think that's also a best practice example. So then my conclusion is it was just great to see how many different, but also how many similar practices are already in place at our partner universities. We have definitely learned from each other, but there's a lot more we can learn and develop together, I think. And this is also one thing we should take with us for the future of the Alliance. Now we have a great basis. We collected and mapped all support networks at the partner universities, but now we have just like to interconnect the support services of the alliances in real life. So we have done it on paper now, but our aim should be to get them connected even more in real life. So yeah, that was it from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Victoria, and thank you especially for highlighting in the end that we have a long way to go in the future, and we will strive to do it. And also thank you for underlining the complexity of it all. It's really complex, as every partner university is in a certain context, and things are happening all the time. And the Ukraine conflict now, the Ukraine war, is showing us how priorities also change as far as the people we're sort of trying to target. So something that was not a priority at all at Vilnius University, for instance, now has become the priority. So this makes things very, very complex. So thank you very much. I'm very sorry we're a little late, so I would invite you to take a short coffee break. I will keep it to 15 minutes if possible. So I will see you back here at 11:45, if you don't mind, so that we have time to discuss later on. So have a very nice break, and I will see you in a bit. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you. Amina.
Hi. You okay?
I'm fine. How are you?
Good. I feel like the gang is reunited on this call. It's really nice though. Yeah.
It is. It is. I'm so happy to have you here.
You too. God. Monday morning though.
Yeah.
At least we're 1 hour behind. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's true.
When I got the thing in my calendar, it said it's going to start at 8 a.m. I was like, I won't even be in the office by then, but it's been good.
Oh, that's great. Okay. Let's see if people are able to come back on this Monday morning. Let's give people a couple more minutes. Okay, maybe we can start just chatting while we wait for the other people to come back. So I don't know if any of the participants present here now have any questions for our speakers. So I do have one. It's very wide, but maybe we can start from there. Benedetta, I don't know if you want to ask something. We can hear you, Benedetta.
Sorry, thank you. Yes, I have also a kind of broad question, but it is linked to the title of this webinar. The question is, how do you experts that I'm really thanking so much for your incredible presentations, think we might join forces towards a common goal? Because in my experience, and I'm the head of the inclusion unit at Padua University, I've been here for not too long, but anyway, 12 years, dealing with initially disability and learning disorders issues, and then progressively more and more with a broader inclusion objective, much broader, wider. And what I see is that every year, many questionnaires arrive, many projects are set up, and every one of them requests for our contribution, for us to collect data, to give feedback, to say at what pace we are, the state of the arts, and so on and so forth. And it's so much work because there are all these inputs and all these requests, and they are very similar to each other sometimes. So how could we join forces? How maybe you at the high policy level, at the European level, could help us to kind of feel all this process, which is so fundamental, more sustainable for every one of us. And I'm asking any one of the speakers. Thank you.
I don't know who would like to start. Should I pick, or anybody volunteering?
I can start.
Okay, great, Juan. Thank you.
Yes, I mean, I think it's a very relevant question, right? Of course, we are in a different position because we are a student network that is present across Europe. So what we try to do when we do this kind of projects is to think about, let's say, different types of changes, right? And different types of implementation measures. I think you could see that in your presentation. We propose policy changes, which is how do you structure your grants, how do you carry out your communication strategy, etc. And those rely, of course, on the university. Those are advocacy policy proposals that then in the end, the university should implement, the NA should implement, because in the end, it's going to be up to a university to pay the grants on time. And we know that that's extremely important for inclusion. So I can tell you, I can remind you, I can make advocacy, build a coalition, but that's new. But what we also try to do, and this is the most important part for us, is to show a way forward in terms of how you can build an alliance with our own volunteers and with our own students, right? So for instance, in Padua, we have a student organization, ESN Padua, with around 40, 50 members, and we're trying to make proposals also for you to collaborate with them. So you can, for instance, organize, like a buddy system together. You can plan visits on schools together. You can do that kind of actions together. And what we also offer is to work together in terms of training, building capacity, etc., because we have done it in the past, and it has been quite successful. So for us, a key takeaway is to show that we do not only want to give, let's say, policy advice, we also want to work with you, meaning joining forces so we can implement activities together using the power of our network. Whenever we do this and wherever we do this, it's normally quite successful. Of course, we work with students and volunteers, so capacity might be limited because they are not working for ESN, they're just dedicating some of their time. But we believe that peer-to-peer engagement is really, really important. And I believe that's the key added value that we provide, that in almost 1,000 higher education institutions across Europe, you see ESN sections working on the ground. And if there is that proactiveness also from the institutional side, we're very much happy to to facilitate the discussion, to, you know, like to suggest ideas, to propose elements in which you can work together. So here are a couple of things that I believe should be, you know, like it can be considered when working at the institutional level as well.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Maybe I can continue if, or I don't know if Valerie or Victoria. Anyway, yeah, Benedetta, about the requests of asking information. I mean, I can assume how tiresome that could be, especially then at some point you spend more time talking about what you're doing than actually doing it, which I think it's yeah, something we've all faced at some point. I don't really have a definite answer to this, but what I can share is that the Croatian NA AMPEL, they will become a Salto research center for education and training on inclusion. So I think that's perhaps a good address. I'm still not sure which specific activities they will be doing, but we will be working with them on that. So I think it's good to use existing networks and opportunities, because then we end up, I think this is what happens sort of in the world of streaming, where, you know, Netflix wants to be this streaming platform, and then Amazon Prime wants to be this streaming platform, and Disney, and I don't know what. And then instead of, then you have competition between all of them, and instead of cooperation. So I think this is also one of the challenges that we are facing, and there is an overlap definitely, but then again, I think the issue of inclusion is so broad that the needs are there, and I think the resources are needed. So I don't think that's such a big issue, the level of resources especially, but I can understand that from your side it could be, yes, a bit tiresome to be asked all over and over again for input, and yeah, but nevertheless, thank you very much for providing it. I think it's really helpful also for us, because this is working at the European level. We always want to have more contact with what's called the ground, and more input, but then again, that can require some additional work. So we're also trying to, at least in our work, we're trying to kind of strike the balance of not overburdening the colleagues. So I don't know if I've answered really the question.
Yeah, yes.
Ideas
Yeah.
and thoughts.
Thanks. Thank you so much.
Yes, what I can add, because we are on a daily basis supporting universities, I think what's needed, and that's what we also will tackle now in the new project, is resources that are tailor-made to the context of higher education institutions. And it's okay that Salto is working on inclusion and those topics, but what we mainly see in the higher education context is that it's should focus really on the context of universities. And that's also what we now will do on each of the principles, to really bring together the resources on those topics that are already existent on each of the principles. And I think that's a beneficial and efficient way also to share with the higher education institutions, the resources specific, tailor-made to their context. So because we have seen also that sharing those inspiring practices is most beneficial also for higher education institutions to move forward. So I really believe in the peer learning and sharing the resources tailor-made to the specific context. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your answers. I don't know, Victoria, would you like to add anything on your side? Okay, then I'll give the floor to Ernest, who had his hand raised. Ernest, please.
Hello. Yes.
Hello.
Hi. I have two questions, I guess. One maybe to everyone, because I remember when the representative of Student Network had his presentation. He said that one of the most important issues or things when considering going abroad is financing. And I remember that a couple of years ago, I used to prepare financial agreements where I paid 50% of the Erasmus grant before mobility after the documents were prepared. It was around a month or 2 weeks latest before mobility. And then during mobility, after 1 month before the half of mobility, I was paying the second 50% of Erasmus grant. But our national agency, about this policy changes and implementations, our national agency said that I have to pay 70% before mobility, and 30% they encourage me to pay after mobility. So after the student comes back and gives the certificate or transcript of records, I pay the remaining 30%. And right now I got used to it, but I still believe that this 30% to left out for after mobility, it's too late. And my question is for everybody, maybe you could write in chat, maybe it's different in your universities, in your countries, maybe your national agency allow different kind of division of financing, or how much do you pay your students? Because staff, it's easier, staff get 100% of financing before mobility, but students, since it's a lot of money, they get it divided. I believe that my way 50-50 was better, but maybe you could share your experience. How do you do that? And I have also second question, also to Erasmus Student Network representative. Where do you get information about partner universities? Well, where the students, or in your universities, where do you keep up to date information about, and what kind of information is it about partner universities? Is it only the list of countries and the list of universities, or is it also contact to Erasmus coordinators, to departments, or maybe the numbers of mobilities? Like, we have this interinstitutional agreements between our universities. They are all stored in Erasmus Without Papers network. And there is a lot of information because there's all information from interinstitutional agreements. And also with some of you, I discussed the issue, how about giving access to universities to be able to export information from Erasmus Without Papers network, so that I can import all, I have like 30 interinstitutional agreements, and I would like to have them exported to Excel, so that my students could have access to information about housing, information about insurance, or other information that we have in our bilateral agreements, but we cannot export them from Erasmus Without Papers. And question, what kind of information do students usually have access to when we talk about partner universities that they have to choose from?
I will start by the second one then. I mean, students have access to very limited information precisely because of what you said. So it totally depends on which information either the university collects from their partner universities, or that they can find themselves, right? Of course, then it all depends. What normally happens is that the student does, I mean, some universities have an information package in which, you say, okay, these are our agreements. Here you can find information from different universities. Other students do their own research, but it's a bit, I would say, generally speaking, of course, we don't have the exact data on the details, but it's not that structured. So this is why you can see in the numbers that I presented before that the students feel that kind of information is so important, because they do not have there's not centralized platform to find information about all the universities. So the experience of students really differ, right? Because I don't know, maybe some universities prepare very comprehensive briefings about their partner universities, some others don't. So it's really ad hoc, right? It's really individual, and it's hard to establish, like kind of the norm. Of course, the access that we have as ESN, it's the same that any normal student has, because we don't have access directly to the mobility tool, etc. Right? That is, you have access and NAs and the commission, but we do not have any specific access to these tools. What we do is to collect our own data, and what we try to do is to ask NAs to make some data public, such as the participants' reports, so then we can compare it with our own data. And this is something very interesting. As you know, students fill in the participants' report at the end of the mobility. This is extremely valuable information that then you include also in your final reports in the project. And what we say to NAs and to the commission is that the more information you make public, the easier it's going to be to make comparisons, to make analysis, to understand also these elements, right? Because in those questionnaires, there are questions about how did you find out about the mobility experience? How did you find out about the university? So that data is extremely valuable. Information on push factors to choose a university can be very relevant, in my opinion, also for inclusion purposes. Because if we could understand why students choose a particular university, we can get better at, playing with how we promote different universities to different students. That is one part. And now very fast, the second part, I totally agree. Like if staff gets most of the funding before mobility, maybe, we need to consider that the students do it as well. Because I understand the concerns that some NAs might have and some universities, but I don't think there is data to back it up. So I don't think there is data to prove that if we pay grants upfront, students will not go on mobility or students will not complete their credits. Because anyway, if they sign a grant agreement, they will become, they will owe that money unless they fulfill the criteria.
Yeah.
So I believe it's worth it to overhaul the system and to make it easier. What we see, and this is why I believe this point is so important, is that the differences between countries are already so big that we cannot say that we have a uniform system. The best example are France and Germany. They have very similar mobility numbers, but the receivable of the grants is completely different, even though the mobility numbers are similar. So it's not that the German students are, like defrauding or something with the grants. It's just that maybe things can be changed to improve it. So in my opinion, that's the system that you were implementing before would be much better and more adjusted to the needs of the students. But of course, I will be happy to hear if there are concerns or perspectives from other colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you.
Valerie, what would you like to add something? I don't know.
No, I
Okay.
think yeah, no.
No, I saw you switched on your microphone, so I thought you wanted to say something. So should we give the floor to the next question, or does anybody?
I can see Christine wanted to talk.
Exactly. Yes, Christine, please go ahead.
Hi. First of all, very, very, very insightful information. I'm more on the student side, and I completely agree with what ESN found. It's actually what I hear from other students around us anyway, so I think it is consistent information. Mine is just a quick comment or observation about the last presentation from Victoria on the slide with some of the best practices from the universities. I'm just pulling it up here so I can see what I'm talking about. So there's the one from Vilnius University, and on the page it says information for citizens of the Republic of Ukraine wishing to study or transfer. Of course, on first glance, it looks fantastic. The only problem is that there have been a lot of reports of non-citizens being refused to even transfer to other universities, even though they have been paying tuition and they're in the middle of their studies. A lot of those students are actually belonging to these underrepresented groups and belonging to these, the groups that are not going on mobility programs. And some of the fears are exactly what's happening now with, displaced students from Ukraine. So what I'm trying to say is, it's I'm not faulting Vilnius for the initiative. I'm just saying, like, it goes to show that we talk about inclusion in mobility, and then when it comes to inclusion in mobility, it's hard to implement it because certain things actually hinder and cause fears, greater fears for students who are in underrepresented groups or international students, because they're not sure if they'll even be welcomed in the places they go to because of situations such as these, where students who were in foreign countries under the protection of a student are now in situations where they can't continue their studies, and because of, I don't know, legal requirements by the host country that they've moved to, or the first country of refuge that they're in. So just an observation on that one.
Victoria or Skyste, would you like to say something?
Maybe not, I don't know, maybe I can add. Generally, in Lithuania, the general policy for refugees is quite limited. And this initiative for Ukraine and this initiative is just university initiative, like from the inner resource, from the university resource. We don't have a good common policy, just talk about Lithuania in general. So it's quite sad, but I know the situation that for refugees in general living in Lithuania, it's quite limited situation. So it's, as you said, and from the one part, it's like just Vilnius University try to be, because we very nearly the Ukraine, and we know that a lot of citizens from Ukraine can come and try to implement it the best, how to say, that they can to participate as much as we can to implement it. What I want to mention is just like from the Vilnius University resource, but the general policy is quite limited, and it's still the issue. Still the issue, despite the fact that we try to help in such a situation. But it's very good to see that, how you said, something is breaking. So it's we have maybe have to say a feeling that maybe it could be could show for our government that it could be the best practice, and we can do the same for other refugees despite their citizenship.
Thank you, Skysa, for clarifying this. I don't know if there are any questions. Amina, I saw your hand raised. Earlier.
This was just in response to what Ernest was saying about the funding amounts and things like that. Again, post-Erasmus Turing scheme for us, they have kind of changed the advice to 80% and 20%. So following the 70-30 for Erasmus, so it's not a huge amount, but 10% extra at the beginning. And then also in the UK, like our students receive student loans nationally. And I don't know if other countries have the same model kind of at a national level for funding to support students on not just mobility. This is typically during study years. And those students that are going on mobilities do receive 3 installments. So I believe the first is like term 1, right at the beginning, so September time. Second one is usually January, and then the last one is around Easter. So it is always before the year actually finishes. And recently I was in like a webinar with them, and they said, you know, the students that are going on mobility, especially if they're outside of Europe, where visa requirements and things like that request that they need to show a certain amount of funding to be able to get a visa. So like the US, for example, the university will say they need to show loads of money, which students usually don't have. So even for purposes like that, the student finance kind of company said we would be willing to kind of release the first at least installment of funding earlier, so that students have the ability to demonstrate this. So at least from that level, there's some kind of give, I guess, to facilitate things a little bit more. And I don't know, again, I'm sure different countries have different, I know some students don't get anything. We often hear that from incoming students from certain countries. So I do think we're very lucky, but just a point in terms of how it's done here.
Yeah, thank you, Amina. I don't know if any of our mobility or international officers from any university would like to say something. Benedetta, please.
No. I have a couple of questions. So if they want to reply, please go ahead.
Maybe you should go ahead now.
Can I? Okay.
Yeah.
I have 2 more questions, if possible. One is about the availability of data and data collection that most of you mentioned during your presentations, which is so necessary, so useful, and at the same time, apparently so difficult. So This is actually one experience that we have in Arcus and in Action Line 2. I can talk for Action Line 2 especially, because we are also different. And for example, if in one university is absolutely natural and easy to collect data about students and staff with disabilities, students and staff with, I don't know, senior students, for example, refugee students in other universities and not in mine, for example. I mean, there are all these differences, and they are related both to mainly to national regulation policies about data collection, data privacy, and so on and so forth, sensitive data. So how do you think we could overcome from a top, like a top level, from a European level, this problem, which is every time a local, national problem, which actually makes us become very different, even when we try to work together in one alliance like we are now in Arqus? Do you have any strategies in mind, any ideas? Again, to everyone.
Maybe I can start, not really with a full-fledged strategy, but I have a sense that as the European University Alliances are enrolling, and especially the first batch which you are a part of, I think they're slowly coming to a limit of what is possible to do within current national legislation. And I think the next step in order for the alliance is to operate, and I think inclusion plays a part of that, and there are also some other issues like degrees and so on. I think the national flexibility here is necessary, and well, the education ministers have agreed to move forward with this, to change it. When will this happen? I hope soon, but I'm not really sure. But yes, the national legislation is the biggest, I think, obstacle currently, not only for inclusion, but also for other operations of the alliance, which I'm sure you know better than I do from your daily work. And here, I think this is where the problem lies.
Thank you, Martin. Yeah,
I can
because
also,
oh, okay.
Oh, sorry, no,
please, go ahead.
No, I was saying that I mean I totally agree with what Martin said, and on top of that, what I believe it's key to use existing data sets as much as possible. So what we need to do probably is to get better at using the data that we already collect. This is for me, a very big personal frustration, as you could see before. It's how we use the data from the participants report of Erasmus Plus, because students need to fill that in. It's mandatory for them to, get the final installment of the grant. And instead of kind of having the commission and maybe the NAs sharing it more openly, so we can also work together with universities, with stakeholders, it has been kept a bit in the side. And I don't really believe that that's the best possible approach, because of course, unfortunately, both the commission and NAs lack enough manpower. They lack HR to properly work on this data, etc. That's why we also have Erasmus Plus projects, right? To open it up and to allow stakeholders like the ones that we have here to work on these elements. So I believe that improving existing data sets and using them better, it's a very useful tool. And on top of that, indeed, right? Like I also believe that a very important note that we notice when working on inclusion, or in general when working on data collection, is that quantitative data has limits. So we can not only rely on collecting more and more quantitative data, because in the end, the results are quite similar. So, in our surveys, we tend to see very similar things, like these kind of barriers, etc. So probably what we need to do going forward is to combine the data that we have with more qualitative focus groups, talking to students, testing, like that idea of testing and seeing how the results are going. I believe that in terms of inclusion, going forward, that is going to be something very important. So if we combine the data that we have, I think with SIM, for instance, we have very comprehensive data, but also with FIME, with many other projects for different target groups, and now moving to a more talking to students in a comprehensive way approach, we can make a lot of progress, because what we saw when we did the focus groups and the interviews for SIM is that the overlying elements were basically the same, but the interviews would allow us to understand better what are the exact experiences of students. So this is something that the alliances can do very well. By the way, this concept of international focus groups, bringing students together and listen to them and taking these policy takeaways can be something very useful, and you're in a very good position to do this, bringing together the inclusion unit, I think is the one that you lead, Benedetta, and the international relations units, etc. So that could be my take on how to proceed on the way forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, I don't know if I can comment a little bit on this, because maybe you may think it's a bit of a naive approach, but I think there's a communication issue there also to be tackled a bit differently, because people, if we think about groups, okay, so underrepresented, vulnerable, disadvantaged, and so on and so forth. In some universities, the policies and the local legislation doesn't kind of allow them, or anyway, doesn't give them the pathway to disclose their conditions. If we make them understand the importance of disclosing, because if they disclose, they can benefit from that, they can profit from that, they can have advantages from that. And we explained that, well, engaging, and this means also engaging students' communities, having them on board, engaging them from the very beginning as stakeholders. I'm sure they will voluntarily, in a way, even if the local legislation wouldn't kind of foresee that for them, but they would, on a voluntary basis, probably disclose their situations and their conditions. And we could then have a better idea of these inclusion top-ups that you were talking about. Otherwise, we don't even know they are or they exist, or we risk not knowing that they are present in a big number, maybe in our communities. We don't know them. So I think it would be important also to act from a communication point of view. What do you think about that? Do you think it's a bit naive? Practical approach?
I can jump. So indeed, so what we saw when it comes to the communication I mentioned is, for me, it was a very interesting data point. It's how important it is for students to understand financial conditions, for instance. So because when you're working on it, you might think that it's quite straightforward. Students kind of know, but they don't really know. They don't really know the conditions of top-ups, their grants, etc. There's a data point that I didn't show today, because of course I didn't have enough space to show everything. But so around 15% of students do not even know if they get a top-up or not, right? So they don't know. And from those who get a top-up, they don't even know which kind of top-up they get, like a big percentage of them. So this shows that we need to prioritize more explaining these financial conditions. And this should become a more important element of how we promote opportunities, probably. So I don't think it's naive to refer to that, because I think it's a big gap at the moment in the promotion that we do about mobility. So we talk a lot about the learning agreement, which is key. We talk a lot about certain things, but then students are like, oh yeah, but how is it going to work in terms of the financial conditions? When am I going to get the money, etc.? So in the new program, with the new instruments like the top-up, we probably need to prioritize that a bit more. How do we explain this to students so everybody knows and understands in which conditions they can access a mobility opportunity, just like they understand in most cases the type of grants that they get from the government, in terms of access to higher education in general. So just my take on that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know if any of the speakers or the participants would like to add anything.
May I ask a question?
Please go ahead.
Thank you. In one of the presentations, I heard about working students and involving those students in Erasmus, and I would like to know if there is experience on how to make it feasible and reduce impacts on their jobs, because it's a semester, it means that they won't be available to work. Can you share any information on this, please? Thank you.
Valerie, maybe I think she was referring to your presentation where you showed the categories, say the groups that were targeted in the strategy.
Yeah, but I think important to mention the Erasmus programs are just one part of mobility programs. So for example, also in the Flemish community, we have also the scholarships of the Flemish government who are paying really mobility programs also for students. So there we give, for example, a top up to the working students as well. So that's a financial incentive also to overcome the period. And also, I think that's also one of the topics that we are tackling in the training package, for example, is the variety of programs. And there we see that a lot of short mobility or blended mobilities are very beneficial also for those target groups. So I think that's one of the recommendations as well, that you have to look for a variety of mobility programs as well. And then we see that working students also go into that option. So I think it's important to see it in a broad context and to make some measures, also some positive measures towards those groups.
Mm-hmm. So you don't see any impact. I mean, when they come back, they have their job positions insured somehow.
Yes, yes. Mm.
Anybody from any other university would like to add something on this issue of the working students going abroad? Any detail on top-ups or any kind of other support? Okay. I think the time is almost up, so I would like to wrap up with one last small question. Well, big question, but small answer. So my question would be, so what do we do? So I would like to ask each of our speaker one tip, one very practical tip, for instance, to Juan on like how do we involve students or engage them in designing, for instance, more inclusive mobilities, to Valerie or Martin, how do we network at the European level, to Victoria, what would be the way to network best within institutions themselves, because we know by experience that networking within our own institutions as well is difficult sometimes, or within alliances, or Benedetta, if she would like to say anything on any insight on the issue. So this would be my little question to all of you. And then I think we can go to lunch. So I don't know who would like to start. Just very practical, because this personally was my issue on where to start.
Yeah, I can start if you want. I would say it's very important to I don't know, to present or to know about all the existing networks at the other universities, and just also for myself to see University of Padova has something which is interesting for us, and then bring it to my university. And I think it's very important to just identify the best practices as we did, and then bring them to our universities and tell our staff, our colleagues that there is something already in place we can benefit from, and we can work on, and we can work together. I think we have to make it clear to our colleagues and staff members that there is a lot of benefit waiting for them in Arqus. Experiences, ideas. So I think that's very important to make that clear. Yeah.
Thank you. Very true. Please, anybody else?
I agree with that, of course, but I think what we see at the European, but for most also on the Flemish, and then for most on the institutional level, I think the first thing is also talking about the topic in the institution, because we see now a lot of questions also coming to SIGO, and then we also notice that people don't know what's already existing. So I think doing the self-assessment tool and being aware of what are the topics of inclusive mobility and who can I really involve in my institution, I think that's the most important thing, or an important first step. And yeah, we see then a lot of the institution-wide dialogue who can start. So I think that's I think it's good to have cooperations, but for most also the cooperations in the institution is important.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. That's what we're trying to start from, because you often don't know what happens next door. So
Absolutely.
that's like the first step. I don't know, Martin or Juan would like to add anything?
Yeah, very briefly, I can only support what was said, more networking on different levels within the institutions and among the institutions. And also, I really like Benedetta's point of asking these naive questions. I think this is very important, actually, and to in our interactions to kind of step away maybe from the frameworks and boxes in which we are all looking into this, and kind of try to see it from the perspective of an outsider, let's say, to the field, saying, okay, what are the very practical obstacles? How could they be resolved? And then from this position, trying to influence policy and practice rather than from the inside, in a way, maybe just to have some different perspectives, and in our interactions also kind of to move on. So ask how was it, the naive questions or something like that. I think that's a good way to put it. Well,
Thank you.
And from my side, well, I also agree with everything that has been said. I would like to just underline a couple of things. The first one is the connection between civic engagement and inclusion, in our opinion. So really trying to use the opportunity of having students and alumni as multipliers, work with them to support others, so really make them part of the solution, not only recipients of policy measures, but actually drivers of change. Because if we do that, we will be killing two birds with one stone. So just something to, like to consider when designing also the policies at the institutional level. And the second is the importance of tweaking the programs slowly. It's really the technical fixes in terms of how we pay the grants, how do we structure, the promotion. These might not be big changes, but they can make a lot of difference. So I think there's a need of, like more training, more discussions between universities, more mutual learning, which is something that the alliances are perfect for, to understand how we can make these changes and how they can impact participation in mobility. And yes, and it was a great pleasure being here today, by the way. Thank you so much. Very nice conversations with great fellow speakers, by the way.
Benedetta, please.
Yeah, I would like maybe to focus on what I heard was in the presentations, the inclusion officers role and function. I think that it would be very, very, very important if not only at the national agencies level, but in each higher education, there was one or more inclusion officers. It would be very nice if we could kind of have a couple, a member from the staff with of course the proper knowledge, competencies, experience, etc., and a member, at least one, from the students' body, and working like in pair. I think it would be very important, because it would be very important not only at the local level, also going from central to the departments, as was suggested by Amina in the chat. There are many experiences, not at the central level, not in the international offices, but at the departmental faculty level. And this function could be really like networking in this sense. Like I have always this metaphor of the octopus in my mind, from central to many tentacles going all over and picking everything which is useful to make inclusion more efficient, more effective, more a reality. And then also this roles could be the link for you, for the institutions at the European level, for your organizations to have a referee, an advisor at each higher education institution, being there to be the voice and the representative of the whole university. And I think it would be very important also to train these inclusion officers, so that they have the real competencies, the real knowledge needed, which is a complex one, because when we talk about inclusion, of course, we're talking about such a broad topic that one person needs probably to not be one, but be multiple, very plural, very interdisciplinary, have it an interdisciplinary and be really like a contamination lab, I don't know, but it should be present really in each higher education institution. I really believe that. I don't know what you think about this.
Thank you, Benedetta. Thank you very much. Always very insightful things you say. So I would spend the whole afternoon here discussing with you. Such a pleasure to be here, but I know you all have your commitments probably. So I will let you go for now. Just a couple of words before we close. I think as alliances, as part of an alliance, we have a lot of work ahead, but we're also sort of in a privileged position, as Juan was underlining, because we are in a naturally international context, and we really can pilot, I think, a lot of things. So I really hope that this sort of network here present will have the chance to work again together in the future. In very practical terms, we will share the presentations with all participants and also the recording of the meeting as soon as it is available. And I would really like to wish you a lovely week, and I would really like to thank you very, very much for being here. It's been such a pleasure. I hope you enjoyed the discussion, and really we will keep in touch. And thank you again. Thank you very much, and enjoy your lunch.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Ciao. Ciao. Bye.